Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world you were probably never taught about in school. Imagine the dry wind brushing your face as you're dragged barefoot across a desert, wrists bound, your mouth parched, and every breath coated in dust and fear. You don't know the language. You don't even know where you're going. All you know is that the men who took you did so in the name of God, and that you now belong to them. Welcome to the Islamic slave markets of the early caliphates, where being captured in a jihad raid wasn't just a possibility, it was policy. Under the legal frameworks of Sharia, the Quran and Hadith didn't just permit slavery, they defined it. The rule was simple. If you weren't Muslim, your body was fair game. You're a farmer's daughter in a Christian village on the edge of the Islamic frontier. You woke up to the sound of hooves. By the time the sun rose, your home was a smoldering ruin, and your parents were dead or fleeing. You were spared, but only because your captors saw you as property, not a threat. The men who took you prayed before loading you onto a donkey cart. They called this a ghazwa, a raid in the path of God. Under their law, this wasn't just allowed, it was virtuous. You were a ghanima, a war prize. Their scholars even debated whether it was more rewarding to free you later or sell you for profit. The consensus? Better to sell. Allah would understand. Markets teemed in cities like Baghdad, Damascus and Cairo. Some looked like regular bazaars, but others, like the infamous Zawila slave market in Tripoli, were built for one thing: flesh. You'd stand naked for inspection, fingers probing your teeth, your hips, your eyes. You weren't a person anymore. You were an asset. And the Quran Surah 424, often cited, reminded buyers of their rights over non-Muslim captives. Historians still argue whether this was purely economic or religious. But here's the kicker. Manumission, the freeing of slaves, was encouraged only if the slave converted to Islam. Even then, it wasn't guaranteed. Converts could still find themselves in bondage, especially women. You might end up in the home of a wealthy merchant, forced to clean his carpets and carry his children. Or maybe you'd be trained as a ghulam, a military slave for the Abbasids. Irony check. You'd be drilled to defend the empire that obliterated your village. Yes, you might get fed better than peasants. No, you couldn't leave. Fringe accounts describe eunuch handlers in the markets, separating out young boys for castration en route to elite households. We'll get to that horror show in a later section. For now, know this. If you were lucky, you were simply overworked. If not, you were mutilated. Meanwhile, your captor could earn barakah, divine blessing, for keeping you. It was seen as a form of charity. You were beaten for disobedience. Lightly, of course, as long as no bones were broken. That was haram. And there's the cognitive dissonance. The caliphate saw itself as a beacon of justice. Poets wrote verses about the mercy of their rulers. Mosques filled the skyline. But behind many doors were rows of trembling captives. Greek, Armenian, Nubian, Berber. Each stripped of name, family, and future. On mainstream historical fact, the The 9th century Abbasid court employed thousands of slaves across its institutions, not just in labor, but in administration, military, even scholarship. Some slaves rose in status, yes, but always as property. You could be learned, honored, and still sold at a whim. Now, here's a weird tidbit. Medieval Islamic slave traders actually had return policies. If a buyer claimed a slave was sick, ugly, or poorly trained, the transaction could be reversed under Islamic commercial law. Imagine your value as a defective product being litigated in court. And yet, modern textbooks often skim past this. They highlight the scientific achievements of the caliphates, the paper mills and libraries. They don't mention that many of those scribes were slaves, copying books they could never own. You want out, you pray. But your prayers are dismissed as kufr. Your language is mocked. Your God is a false one. The chains may be leather or iron, but the real weight is the silence. No one in your world thinks you deserve better. You're a body in a system that believes it's moral, lawful, and even pious. And while this was happening across centuries and continents, from the Iberian Peninsula to India, later apologists would insist it was better than what others did. As if that's comfort. As if a gilded cage stops being a cage. You sleep in a courtyard with a dozen others. You don't cry anymore. The last time you did, someone said it was fitna, a disturbance. They made you sleep outside in the cold to learn discipline. You did. Now, when the muezzin calls for dawn prayer, you rise with the others and serve tea. You're 5 years old and already fluent in fear. Your parents wept when the officials arrived, but they didn't fight. What good would it have done? These men came bearing the seal of the Sultan and the firm backing of Islamic law. They were agents of the Dev Shirme, a word your mother had whispered like a curse even before they came. The blood tax. They told your father you were being taken for your own good, that you'd live in the palace, that you might become a great man one day. He nodded silently, because refusing would have meant worse. Maybe exile, maybe death, maybe the rest of your family vanishing next. You're not alone. Alongside you, a caravan of other boys, Slavs, Greeks, Armenians, march under armed watch. You're all Christian, all between 8 and 18, and all snatched away under the same justification: to serve the Ottoman Empire, the most just of nations. That's how they frame it. The idea, officially, is noble. You'll be given food, shelter, and Islamic education. You'll become Muslim, of course. That part isn't optional. And you'll be forged into a janissary, an elite soldier of the Sultan's household troops. Historians still argue whether the Devshirme system was meritocratic or cruelly pragmatic. You can debate ideas when you're not the one being taken. They say you're lucky. Boys drafted into the janissaries are trained in military arts, languages, and religion. You'll grow strong. You'll wear silk and carry swords. You'll walk taller than the peasants who once shared your village. You'll forget their names too eventually. But right now, you just miss your mother. They force you to learn Arabic phrases. Punishment is swift for failure. You're isolated from other Christian children, forbidden from speaking your native tongue. It's called assimilation, but it feels like a slow burning away of who you are. They rename you. They cut your hair. They cut your past. You're told Islam is truth, that your old faith was falsehood, that your baptism was an accident, not destiny. And after weeks of exhaustion and deprivation, you start to believe it. Not because you see the light, but because you need to eat. Because your mind can't fight forever. In time, you learn to handle a musket. You memorize the Quran. You bow when told. Kneel on command. You're taught that the Sultan is the shadow of God on earth. The phrase tastes strange in your mouth, but eventually you say it without thinking. One mainstream fact: the Janissaries were some of the most feared troops in Europe for centuries. Disciplined, loyal, and relentless. But few mention that their loyalty was forged in stolen childhoods, in mass abduction disguised as divine order. And here's a quirky detail. You weren't allowed to marry while serving. Janissaries were celibate, at least on paper, to ensure undivided loyalty to the Sultan. You belonged to him, not to any family, not even your own. The system worked disturbingly well. Generations of Christian boys were molded into the very thing that conquered their people. Some rose high: governors, generals, even viziers. But they were always eunuchs in the spiritual sense, unrooted, deracinated, power without origin. You learn to enjoy the rhythm of military drills. You learn not to flinch when a brother is whipped for hesitation. You even laugh, eventually, at the jokes your captors tell. You're one of them now, at least on the outside. But something cracks when you're deployed to a Balkan village, one that looks like your own. You're told to burn the church. You hesitate. The officer notices. His gaze says everything. Don't remember. You light the torch. Historians have long debated whether the Dev Shirmeh was unique in its strategy, or just another tool in the long history of imperial control. Was it better than execution? Than mass enslavement? Maybe. But when you're the child holding the torch, those questions feel hollow. There's no plaque for your family, no record of your original name. Even your dreams speak in Turkish now. You tell yourself this is your new fate, that you're chosen, that the old gods have nothing to say anymore. But late at night, lying on a soldier's cot beneath a silk banner stitched with Quranic calligraphy, you sometimes imagine your mother's voice, soft, worried, humming a lullaby you barely remember. The tune fades with each passing year. Like your past, like your people, you stand naked beneath the desert sun, your wrists shackled, your eyes covered. But even without seeing, you know what's next. You've heard the screams. They told you the caliphate needs eunuchs. It's not personal, it's policy. The surgeon steps forward. Not a healer, but a butcher, who's performed this operation so many times his hands move without hesitation. There's no anesthetic. There's no consent. Only the quiet approval of Islamic jurists who've declared this process permissible, as long as it's performed before the slave arrives in Islamic territory. That's the loophole. You're held down. You try to struggle, but your body has learned that obedience means survival. One slip, one defiant word, and your fate worsens. And so you lie still. The blade descends. Most don't survive. That's the unspoken truth. Estimates suggest that up to 90% of the boys castrated for Islamic courts, harems and mosques died from blood loss, shock, or infection. But those who lived, like you, became valuable property. A eunuch could be trusted, they said. He was safe around women, incapable of sexual temptation, incapable of rebellion. The irony? Under Islamic law, a mutilated man is considered impure. But in practice, purity is redefined when politics demands it. Historians still argue whether this contradiction was hypocrisy or just another example of theology adapting to empires. You're healed in a slave stable, given broth, wrapped in bandages, and told you're blessed to be alive. You don't feel blessed. You feel hollow. Eventually, you're sold. The buyer is wealthy, maybe a caliph, maybe a merchant. Either way, you're brought into a world of gold-trimmed walls, rose-scented halls, and veils that hide the women you're now meant to guard. You're stationed outside a harem, weaponless, but feared. Because you've already paid the ultimate price in flesh. Here's the strange part. Eunuchs often rose to incredible power. Some ran palaces, whispered into the ears of sultans, or controlled the flow of imperial secrets. One such man, Kislar Aga, chief of the Black Eunuchs, held enormous sway over the Ottoman court for centuries. His title literally meant Master of the Girls. You wonder if he remembered the moment he became what he was. You're trained in etiquette, speech, Quranic law. You're told your new role is sacred. The harem, they say, is a sanctuary. You're the gatekeeper. But your dreams remain full of iron and fire. There's a strange sense of invisibility now. The women barely look at you. You exist between categories. Not fully man, not quite slave, not ever free. You are erased in plain sight. You see concubines come and go. Some arrive weeping, some fight, some adapt. You're not allowed to speak to them unless ordered. Yet you hear their whispers about home, about children they might bear, about escape. You begin to wonder, if you had died on that table, would it have been mercy? One mainstream truth rarely discussed in classrooms. The Islamic world had a vast slave economy, and eunuchs were critical to its machinery. Unlike the transatlantic trade, which moved millions in chains across oceans, this system operated over centuries, slower, subtler, and often forgotten. But its cruelty was no less sharp. Your identity, once carved in your body, begins to fade from your mind. You no longer remember what your voice used to sound like before it cracked from screaming. You speak with composure now, soft and submissive. That's what's expected. And yet, behind closed doors, you've seen the darker layers of the palace. The rivalries, the poisonings, the discarded girls. One day, you're summoned to deliver a message for a prince. You walk through marbled halls, past guards who don't even glance at you, because eunuchs are seen as tools, not threats. This invisibility becomes your armor. You listen, you learn, you survive. Historians still argue about the ethics of this system. Some claim it was better than Roman slavery, or that eunuchs had real social mobility. But comparisons don't erase scars. And mobility doesn't restore what was taken with a dull knife. The Quran speaks against mutilation, but empires speak louder. When convenience calls, even sacred verses can be softened by fatwas and footnotes. You're not allowed to marry. You're not allowed to father children. You will die as you are, alone, erased from family trees and ancestral lines, a silent servant of a golden court. And when you're finally too old to serve, they'll replace you. Another boy, another scream, another silence. The day begins with incense and ends with silence. Somewhere in between, you are sold. You're young, pretty, terrified. Your skin is scrubbed raw in a public bath. Your hair oiled, your wrists shackled with silver bands, not to imprison, but to advertise value. You are concubine stock now, and the buyers are waiting. They examine you with the same clinical interest a man gives a horse. Teeth, hips, composure. Some prefer resistance. Others like docility. Either can fetch a good price, depending on the market. And this one is thriving. This isn't a back alley in the desert. It's the center of a flourishing Islamic city, maybe Cairo or Damascus, where slave markets have dedicated neighborhoods, a bustling, normal part of life. The Quran permits this after all. Ma malakat aymanukum, what your right hands possess, a phrase repeated often, normalized even more. You are now one of those possessions. They tell you it's lawful, that Islam prohibits enslaving fellow Muslims, so you must be kafir, an unbeliever. The logic is simple. Your body is theirs because your soul refuses submission, not to your master, to his God. You're led into his home, not a hovel, a courtyard ringed with arches, flowers, fountains. Other women are there, some older, some broken. One of them brushes your hair gently that first night. She doesn't speak your language, but her kindness is a brief mercy. He enters. You do not speak. You do not consent. There is no court to plead your case, no scroll of rights to invoke. You are part of his household, like the rugs, the spices, the cups, but unlike them, you bleed. Historians still argue whether concubinage in the Islamic world offered protection compared to other systems. Some note that children born to concubines could become legitimate heirs, that concubines could be manumitted and married. But others point out that most never reached that status. They died in childbirth, in silence, or were sold again once beauty faded. Your value is tied to his desire. If you bear him a child, a son especially, you may gain the title Walad, mother of a child. That offers a chance at freedom, a slim one. The legal scholars say he cannot sell you then, but he can still ignore you, replace you, let you rot in some dark upper room where the wind never visits, and he probably will. You're not alone in this fate. The Abbasid caliphs maintained harems with thousands of concubines. The Ottomans institutionalized the practice, raising concubines in the imperial harem from childhood, educating them, preparing them for the Sultan's attention. Sometimes one would rise, like Hurrem Sultan, a former slave who became the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent. But for every Hurrem, there were hundreds who simply vanished, a fringe detail. In some regions, eunuchs managed concubine households and were ordered to maintain records of usage, to keep track of which woman belonged to which man, who had borne children, who was too old to tempt. You were a tally in a ledger, a name in a language not your own. Some women found influence in subtle ways, manipulating jealousy, mastering court intrigue, securing their children's future. But even that power was a gilded cage. You are only powerful so long as you are desired. And what if you're not desired? What if your eyes remind him of a place he once raided and wants to forget? What if your accent grates? You're given menial tasks, locked away, sold again, or worse. In some cases, women were forcibly converted and married off to poor Muslims as charity. Others were quietly killed. You remember your home sometimes, the scent of your mother's bread, your father's voice telling stories. That world feels imaginary now, like a half-remembered dream, swallowed by sand and time. You can't speak those memories out loud. Someone might report you for a rebellion, for blasphemy, for remembering too much. You don't wear chains anymore. You wear silk. But the thread around your throat is just as tight. You once heard an imam say that concubines brought spiritual reward to their masters if treated kindly, that their presence in a household was a divine mercy. You wonder if God agreed or if his silence is part of the system too. At night, you stare at the ceiling, wondering if the stars outside still look the same. The year turns cold, your roof leaks, your pantry is empty. But still, you pay, because you are not Muslim, and because Quran 9:29 says so. You owe the jizya, the head tax on non-believers living under Islamic rule, not a one-time payment, a yearly ritual of humiliation, performed publicly, documented precisely, and enforced with cheerful consistency. Today is collection day. You line up behind your neighbors, clutching what little silver your family has left. The collector's table waits under a canopy, beside soldiers with curved swords and well-fed horses. One man ahead of you argues he's beaten. Another can't pay. His daughter is taken instead. The jizya isn't just a tax. It's a message. You are tolerated, but barely. It's what allows you to live without converting. To walk the streets, own a shop, even worship, quietly, behind closed doors. But with every coin you hand over, you're reminded, this isn't your civilization anymore. Your religion is wrong. Your status is tolerated. Your worth is measured annually, one demeaning coin at a time. Some records, like those from 8th century Egypt or Andalusian Spain, describe non-Muslims being slapped or marked during payment, required to kneel or bow. Others suggest that in wealthier towns, The ritual was more dignified, especially when Christians or Jews were skilled artisans. But either way, the power imbalance was unmistakable. You're here to prove submission, not just to the tax collector, but to the social order itself. Historians still argue whether jizya was purely economic or intentionally punitive. Was it simply a revenue stream, like modern taxes? Or was it calibrated pressure to encourage conversion, to identify the unconverted, or to slowly erode communal identity? You can answer that yourself because you've seen your neighbors change. The baker down the street took Shahada last year, publicly. He now wears a white cap and smiles more around soldiers. His taxes vanished. His bread got cheaper. His son stopped being harassed. You can't help but notice the direct correlation between belief and bread. Conversion becomes tempting. Not because your heart has changed, but because your stomach has. And your child's fever doesn't care about theology. It needs food, medicine, a life not punished by the calendar. This is how civilizations crumble, not with sword fights and sieges, but with spreadsheets and ledgers. The money runs dry. The patience runs thin. People convert to survive. You hear rumors that some regions exempted monks or priests from jizya. That's true, sometimes. But most weren't so lucky. In parts of Persia, entire Zoroastrian communities were wiped off the fiscal map. First taxed, then broken, then absorbed. No fire temples remain. Only ruins with soot-stained stones that once held eternal flames. You try to stay strong. Your family clings to tradition. Your daughter still lights the Sabbath candle. Your father still tells stories in your old tongue. But each year, fewer neighbors join the rituals. Some pretend not to remember them. Others move away toward Muslim-majority towns where jizya doesn't follow. Even the graves are taxed. Some communities were required to pay fees to bury their dead according to non-Muslim rites. One quirky tidbit: in some cities, jizya collectors were also paid bonuses for each conversion they reported, turning bureaucrats into bounty hunters of belief. You're not angry anymore, just tired. When the collector reaches you, he doesn't look you in the eyes. He tallies your coins, nods to his scribe, and gestures for you to move along. That's it. No thanks, no mercy. Just procedure. Your hands tremble as you leave. Back home, your wife says the roof leaked again. You scrape mold off the bread and tell her you've paid. One more year. One more chance. You think about the Quranic verse sometimes. Fight those who do not believe in Allah until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. The part about feeling subdued sticks with you. Mission accomplished, you suppose. But still you wonder, how long can this go on? How long until your grandchildren no longer remember the prayers you say before dinner? How long until their names are Arabic, their scriptures foreign, their old gods buried beneath the taxes you paid in vain? Your eyes sting, but not from the cold. The books are gone. Not stolen, not borrowed. Burned, or worse, overwritten. Your temple scrolls, your ancestral texts, your poetry, your laws, vanished in smoke or erased beneath Arabic ink. It started with a decree. A new governor, pious and educated, ordered all official records to be kept in Arabic. Your scribes protested. They were scholars after all, fluent in Greek, Syriac, Coptic, or Persian. But protest is a dangerous habit in a caliphate. So the scribes adapted, or they vanished. You remember the day the school changed. The old teacher, blind in one eye, was dismissed for refusing to recite the Quran before class. His replacement smiled a lot, quoted hadiths, and told children that their own language was backward. He was young, sharp, fluent in Arabic, with a Quran in his bag and a stick in his hand. Soon, your son began to forget your native script. Letters once sacred now looked foreign, clumsy. At first you corrected him, then you gave up. Arabic was the language of administration, of trade, of status. Want a job? Speak Arabic. Want protection? Speak Arabic. Want food? Pray in Arabic. This wasn't new. Centuries earlier, in the 8th century, the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik had made Arabic the sole language of government. A single line of Arabic script now stamped every coin in the empire. All official correspondence, from taxes to pardons, flowed in one tongue. And with language came power. The Quran itself, they said, could only be truly understood in Arabic. Translations were interpretations, tolerated at best, discouraged at worst. So your priests, your poets, your playwrights silenced not with swords, but syllables. Historians still debate whether this was calculated cultural erasure or just efficient bureaucracy. Was it a tool of unity or a weapon of assimilation? Your village knows the answer, because when the books burned, so did memory. When Arabic names replaced native ones, so did lineage. When your son came home and couldn't read the family tombstone, something broke that can't be glued back. Here's a curious little fact. Some Islamic scholars preserved Greek texts, Plato, Aristotle, Galen, but only selectively and always through an Islamic lens. Ideas were filtered, twisted to fit theology. The golden age of Islamic science often relied on foundations they'd once outlawed. You hear of libraries rising in Baghdad, full of translated knowledge. But your own city's scrolls were incinerated. The contradiction stings. Even time itself is rewritten. Calendars change. Festivals disappear. A new year begins, not with your ancestral solstice, but with the Prophet's flight to Medina. Your old rhythms are declared pagan. Your new ones are compulsory. And with every Arabic sermon, every Friday call to prayer, echoing from the minaret that replaced your temple, the old sounds fade from memory. Your grandchildren mispronounce their grandparents' names. Your daughter marries a man who recites hadith instead of lullabies. You're still alive. But your culture isn't. One village tried to resist. They hid books underground, behind false walls. But someone informed. The imam called it blasphemous hoarding, and the town square glowed orange for hours. Smoke laced with ink and leather filled the air. A child cried, clutching a melted stylus. Do you remember your wedding song? The one sung by your mother, in that lilting dialect that's now forbidden in public. You hum it under your breath, just a whisper. just for you. Because if you stop, even for a year, there'll be no one left to remember the tune. And soon, the only version of your history will be the one written by your conquerors, in a language that never knew your gods, your jokes, or the way your grandmother used to say "I love you" with bread instead of words. The ink of the victor runs deep, and in this caliphate, silence isn't empty. It's crowded with everything you've lost. It happens slowly, like winter creeping into your bones. Not a sword, not a decree, but a hunger that tightens day by day. You're standing in line for grain, again, but this time, your name's not on the list. You show your tax receipt. They shrug. The rules changed. Muslims first, then the converts, then maybe. You haven't converted, not really, but you've thought about it. Everyone has. It's not about faith, it's about food. This is the part they don't teach in school, that sometimes the most effective force of conversion isn't theology. It's the rumble in your stomach and the look in your child's eyes when she asks why the neighbors eat meat every Friday while your stew is just water and onions. Remember that tax we mentioned, jizya, the one non-Muslims pay with willing submission and feel themselves subdued, as Quran 9:29 puts it. It's not just a financial burden, it's a brand. You pay more, you get less. You're marked, monitored, and kept exactly where they want you. And then one year, the crops fail. You go to the officials. They wave you off. Relief grain is for the faithful. Your prayers apparently weren't heard. You consider borrowing from your Muslim neighbor, but his face tightens. Lending to non-Muslims is frowned upon now. He whispers that the Imam is watching. Historians still debate how often mass starvation triggered conversion waves. Was it truly belief? Or just survival instinct in robes? Your cousin finally breaks. He converts, takes the name Abdullah, and by the next week, he's eating bread dipped in honey, the kids in new tunics. He invites you to the mosque. You decline, for now. One quirky record from Andalusia tells of a village where every man converted after a sudden jizya hike, except one. They made him pay for all of them. He died in debt, and they buried him with no prayers. At some point, it becomes easier to pretend, to mutter the Shahada under your breath when soldiers pass, to wear the cap, dress the kids modestly, and stop correcting their Arabic. You tell yourself it's temporary, just until things get better. But things don't get better. One day, your youngest daughter refuses to eat until you say Bismillah. She learned it in school. Her teacher says it invites blessings. She doesn't even remember the old mealtime chant you grew up with. And maybe the scariest part, you don't either. Your wife stopped lighting the ancestral lamp weeks ago. Said it was drawing attention. Your neighbor was flogged for idolatrous behavior. He was just singing. There's still a priest somewhere nearby, hiding, offering forbidden rites in the woods or behind crumbling barns. But fewer people visit. The risk is too high, the reward too vague. You heard he was caught once, forced to spit on a cross. Then they let him go. Just long enough for the rest of you to see him weep. Sometimes you pass the mosque and hear the Friday sermon booming through the courtyard. It's in Arabic, but you catch bits of it now. Verses about submission, about truth, about the punishment for apostates. Apostasy is death, not metaphorically, literally. You can't return once you've chosen the truth. You convert today, you're Muslim for life. No backsies. And so the game becomes generational. You don't believe, but your children don't know that. They grow up thinking you always did. They learn to fast, to bow, to quote. One day they thank you for showing them the path. You nod, unsure whether to laugh or cry. They call it dimitude, a status, a protection racket dressed in scripture. But it works. It doesn't need chains when it has scarcity. It doesn't need threats when it has taxes. And it doesn't need soldiers when it has children asking why their friend got shoes and they didn't. This is the long game of assimilation. Not a battle, not a massacre, just quiet pressure, hunger, a name change, a whispered prayer, an old god forgotten under a pile of dates and flatbread. And when someone asks you, years later, what made you finally convert? You'll say it was time. You'll say it was peace. You'll say it was divine will. But really, it was the empty bowl on your table and the full ones next door. You don't remember the last time you heard your ancestor's name aloud. Not in public, not even whispered. The gravestones in your village used to carry your script, rounded letters curling like vines. Now they're gone, sanded flat, recarved in Arabic. Some weren't even translated, just reused. One day, your eldest comes home from school and points at an old symbol on the lintel of your home, the eye of your forebears. He calls it pagan and says the teacher told him it brings curses. You tell him it's for protection. He frowns and changes the subject. This is what extinction looks like. Not through fire or war or the sword, but through repetition, subtraction, and slow forgetting. Your temple is now a mosque. The dome fits awkwardly on top, like a borrowed hat. But they say it was always meant to be this way. Historians still argue whether conversion of sacred spaces was motivated by practicality or domination. But either way, your prayers don't echo here anymore. They removed the bell, replaced it with a call, melodic, haunting. At first it made your blood chill. Now it's background noise. Your youngest hums it while playing with a stick in the dust. You think back to your father, how he whispered the old chants while stirring stew, how he hid that ancient amulet under his tunic. You buried him without it. The imam oversaw the burial. You didn't want questions. You didn't want attention. There was no fight, no stand. Just hunger, tax, silence. The local judge ruled that your ancestral language was no longer fit for legal documents, then for schools, then for anything public at all. Just learn Arabic, they said. It's more elegant anyway. A generation passes. Your tongue stumbles over the old prayers, then stops trying. Even stories vanish. Your grandmother used to tell tales of cloud spirits and river gods. They were bedtime rituals, little myths folded in laughter. Now, Your daughter's lullaby is a verse from the Quran. She says it calms her dreams. You nod. You've heard it so many times. It might as well be your own. Remember that quirky tidbit from centuries ago? In North Africa, there's a report of Berber tribes being fined every time they use their native tongue in court. So they stop going to court altogether. Then they stop speaking. That's the trick. Once the past becomes too inconvenient, too risky, too hard to remember, it slips away. You try once, just once, to recreate a festival from the old days. You hang a garland of dried flowers at the door, light a tiny oil lamp at dusk. A neighbor sees it, reports it. The imam arrives with a calm but cold expression. He asks if you've relapsed. You stammer, apologize, take it down. You swear it won't happen again. That night, your children ask what the lamp was for. You lie. Say it was nothing. You still walk the same streets, eat the same grains, but it's all new now. Rebranded, realigned. The well at the center of the village used to have carvings of your people's cosmology, now chiseled flat, then plastered over with the verse about ablution. The cosmos traded for purity laws, and no one resisted. Because resistance is hard to pass down when your children speak a different language, when your holidays are illegal, when your gods have no names anymore. Your people became Muslims not by conviction, but by attrition, piece by piece, ritual by ritual. The final prayer was whispered not in firelight, but into silence. And when it stopped echoing, the world moved on. And still, when people talk of conquest, they think of swords and sieges. Not hunger and paperwork, not language policies and mosque quotas, not the quiet moment when a child forgets the taste of a dish her grandmother once made, because saffron is too expensive and cumin is now for Fridays only. This isn't defeat, it's absorption, erosion, the tide licking away your shoreline one wave at a time, and you're still here, technically. But what's left of you is housed in a language you didn't grow up with, a religion you didn't choose, and a history you no longer recognize. No one burned your house. They just rewrote your deeds. No one killed your faith. They just replaced it with something louder, state-sanctioned, and better funded. Extinction without a battle, the cleanest conquest of all. You sit at your desk in school, notebook open, ink still wet, as your teacher draws a timeline of the Islamic Golden Age on the chalkboard. Baghdad, Cordoba, Cairo. He talks about advancements in science, medicine, astronomy, zeros, scalpel designs, libraries with more books than all of Europe combined. Tolerant, he says, a time of harmony between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. You raise your hand. You ask about the people who used to live in your region, the ones whose shrines are now buried under asphalt, whose stories aren't in the textbooks. The teacher sighs. He reminds you they converted, that everything changed, that things got better. Your mouth stays shut for the rest of class. That night, you look up the old maps. They have different names for your land. Some native, some Persian, some Roman. They describe cities that no longer exist. Temples, statues, entire dialects that never made it into your history books. You learn more in one evening than you did in a semester. And you start to wonder, is this golden age story even yours? You remember the eunuchs from earlier, those castrated guardians who served in mosques and harems. You think about how many came from your people. No testicles, no legacy. They're in the paintings sometimes. Pale faces, blank expressions, expensive silk. But never the main subject. Concubines too, locked in palaces, brought in from the Caucasus or Central Europe or East Africa. You can find them in poetry, praised for their beauty, their obedience, their tragic devotion to their Muslim lords. Their real names, though? Forgotten. Historians still argue whether the tolerance of the caliphates was genuine pluralism or merely strategic inclusion. Some say dhimmis, non-Muslims under Islamic rule, were protected. Others say they were second-class citizens kept in line with taxes and fear. The truth, as usual, depends on who's writing it. The quirky tidbit you stumble across. A caliph in Al-Andalus once banned books by non-Muslim authors, then burned his own library years later, calling it full of useless heresy. So much for enlightenment. In the margins of your notebook, you jot down a quote. History is written by the victors. You underline written. Then again, harder. Your family celebrates Eid now. You bring dates and wear clean clothes. But your grandfather once told you about a different harvest festival, one with torches and ancestor dances. He only mentioned it once. When you asked him again, he pretended not to know what you meant. You begin to notice patterns. The old cemetery outside town has markers with faint, scratched-out symbols. Crosses, stars, things you can't name. You ask your aunt what they meant. She says, "We don't talk about that." Then she changes the subject to honey prices. There's a street in the capital named after a general who conquered your people. A statue of him stands where your temple used to be. He holds a sword in one hand, a Quran in the other. School children pose for photos under his bronze boots. You finally visit a museum. The pre-Islamic wing is tucked in a basement hallway, barely labeled. A few cracked pots, a rusted idol, a small plaque calling it primitive. Upstairs, the Islamic art glows under golden light, calligraphy, carved wood, silk. One culture archived, the other exalted. And still, they tell you it was tolerant. You begin to notice how absence feels, how empty corners of your culture are patched over, celebrations rebranded, names changed, stories redacted. No one says your people were wiped out. That would be impolite. But they were, just politely. They were absorbed, disappeared in census records, replaced in architecture, faded in names. Their gods turned into demons. Their stories, if told at all, cast as backward or heathen or silly. And when you ask why no one talks about it, people shrug. That was a long time ago, they say. Let it go. You want to argue, but you also want to stay out of trouble. So you nod, smile, recite your lines. You tell your children about the golden age, like the textbooks say, about tolerance, science, progress. You leave out the eunuchs and the concubines, the blood tax, the jizya. You do it to keep them safe, to help them fit in. Because deep down, you know what happens to those who don't assimilate. They get remembered as footnotes, if they're remembered at all. You stand in silence before a crumbling wall. There's no plaque, no guide, no prayer mat. Just weeds growing between bricks that once supported a temple, or maybe a church, or maybe a home. No one remembers. No one wants to. Around you, modern life buzzes. Cars honk, minarets call, advertisements flash in Arabic. But here, the past stares through cracks. You touch the stone and try to imagine who walked here. A priest, a scholar, a mother with a water jug. Whoever they were, they left no descendants. Not one soul to carry their name. You scan for inscriptions, carvings, any sign. There's none. It's as if this place and everyone who loved it was swallowed whole by time, or rather, erased, cleaned out, replaced. That's the thing no one tells you about the Caliphate's conquests. The bodies weren't always stacked in fields. Some died with their names changed, their gods replaced, their grandchildren taught a different story. And then, nothing. The Caliphate's power was not just swords and taxes. It was absorption. It was silence, a kind that outlasts screams. You remember what your uncle once whispered during a family dinner. That you might be descended from people who used to worship in the mountains before Islam came. That they had songs, dances, a language with no surviving grammar book. Then he shook his head and said, "But that's all myths." You asked him where the myths came from. He didn't answer. There are no graves to visit. Most were destroyed, repurposed, or built over. You search old maps, but they're vague. You ask elders, but they shrug. It was long ago, they say. And besides, we're Muslim now. You nod, but it feels hollow. You walk through a marketplace, and you notice the smells of spices, the calls to prayer, the Arabic script on every storefront. None of it yours. Not really. It's been made yours, sure, through education, conversion, loss. But once, your people had a different alphabet, a different sound in their prayers, different faces in their stories. And now, no one can even pronounce their names. You find a rare academic paper. It mentions a lost people, possibly your ancestors. The footnotes are full of qualifiers. Allegedly, possibly, uncertain. Even their bones don't get certainty. Historians still argue whether these disappearances were genocide or assimilation, whether forced conversion is a form of extinction, whether cultural death counts if it takes 100 years instead of 10. You don't need a scholar to tell you. You know what it feels like to be the echo of a people who can no longer speak. The quirky detail? In one corner of an old Quran manuscript, a monk's note was found, written sideways, almost hidden. I write this so someone may remember us. No one knows who he was. The ink has almost faded. You think about that note every time you light a candle. The mosque you attend has a beautiful dome. It's built over what used to be a Zoroastrian fire temple. Before that, maybe a Roman fort. Before that, who knows? Your Imam once joked that Islam knows how to recycle. You didn't laugh. You meet a researcher who tells you that the word for infidel, used in old texts, applied to your people. Not just outsiders, not just enemies. You thank her, then you go home and stare at the mirror. You wonder what your great-great-great-grandmother sounded like, what lullaby she sang, what dreams she had, if she even had the right to dream. And that's the wound. Not that you were conquered, but that the world now denies it ever happened. That you're told you were always part of this faith. That your blood tax, your conversions, your lost culture, none of it matters. Because if there are no witnesses, there's no crime. You begin to keep your own notebook. Names, fragments, forbidden stories. A kind of soft rebellion. Not to fight, just to remember. You tell your children bedtime stories, not from their textbooks, but from old legends, half remembered and out of order. They giggle, ask questions, fall asleep before you finish. But you tell them anyway. Because if someone doesn't speak the name, even in whispers, it dies forever. And you? You're the last echo. Now slowly, gently, you set that notebook down. The pages curl a little in the warm breeze. But the words stay still. They've waited long enough. Outside, the city hums on. But in this quiet moment, you're allowed to grieve what was lost, even if no one else does. You breathe in steady and slow. Maybe history didn't save your people. Maybe no monument was built for them. But tonight, in the hush between heartbeats, they live again. In memory, in imagination, in story. Let that be enough. Let the weight of time grow lighter with every breath. You are not alone. Somewhere, others remember too. Maybe not the same songs, not the same names, but the silence between them? That's shared, so close your eyes now. Let the past settle behind your eyelids like dust on forgotten stone. And as the night deepens, let your thoughts soften. Let your breath lengthen. Let your body rest. There is peace in remembering. There is power in whispering names the world forgot. Sleep now. You've carried enough.